Hi, everybody. Welcome to Transformational Psychology with Ryan Holzapfel. I'm having Dr. Clifford Mayes on again today. He's a professor of educational psychology, the founder of Archetypal Pedagogy, and arguably the leading figure in Jungian educational theory today. We're going to talk about his latest book, the 13th, called Archetype, Culture, and the Individual in Education. What we get into here at the beginning is basically talking about how education is more than something that happens in the classroom. Education is a lifelong process that is constituted of having a learning relationship with others and with the world. And he's going to talk about how important it is to shift from a perspective of power over, where people have to bestow their authoritative knowledge upon us, to a perspective of a shared field of learning that is much less hierarchical and much more based on mutual respect and understanding, as well as humility to know that I don't know everything. I believe what I believe. I'm willing to learn more, and I'll stand my ground until I have more certainty. And I'm flexible. It's so important. So we get into that. We also get into Martin Heidegger at some point, and we get into various topics in between, so I just need to bookmark a couple of these for you. We talk about Heidegger and his profound work of philosophy, Being and Time, and how it really helps us understand the phenomenology of being human. The problem is, Dr. Mayes brought up how Heidegger had some very questionable and needless to say, even condemnable choices where he was affiliated with the Nazi Party. And he talks about how he wrestled with this. And what I wish I had said, but we moved on to other things, I didn't have a chance to say this, is that we are very familiar now with the idea that somebody's ideas and their character easily get conflated. So if something comes out of somebody's mouth and you don't like that person, or that person might have done some very horrible things, we are more likely to be dismissive of their ideas. I think this is a mistake, because ideas as an entity unto themselves don't always necessarily reflect the whole person that they come from. Somebody can have a very good idea and yet have some very questionable behaviors in their life. So we should not, in my opinion, outcast ideas based on the people who had them. We should look at ideas on their own merits. Does the idea have an ethical framework? Is the idea true? Does the idea have good insights? How does the idea play into my life? And then we decide based on the idea. And that's my opinion on how Heidegger should be read. If you read Being and Time, there's nothing in there that would indicate his personal shortcomings directly. We are just looking at ideas on their own merits. Moving on from that, we get into the collective unconscious, a Jungian theory, and genetics. And I need to bookmark this and give you some further context. First, I make one error where I say human beings share 99% of the genes, the 1% of genes is where we differ. I believe I said that. That was a mistake. The actual truth is that we share 99.9% and we differ in the 0.01%, which actually turns out to have a significant impact on our psychology, behaviors, and traits. Obviously, you look at diverse human physiological traits and you can just see how much that 0.01% makes from a physical perspective, but research also shows that it's very powerful from a personality predisposition perspective. I hope you enjoy the podcast with Dr. Mayes. Let's let this thing roll and just have a wonderful day. You are all awesome. I really appreciate you, and sending my love and compassion, and hope everybody's doing okay in these difficult times. I'm here with Dr. Clifford Mayes. I'm expert in Jungian and depth psychology as well as in educational psychology and basically how we educate ourselves, how we institute education in the world. We had a fantastic podcast, must have been over a year ago, where we really dove in to the problems with our educational system and how it turns the individual into a commodity. And since you've published a book called Archetype, Culture, and the Individual in Education, which I might add, I started reading this morning, and you have an uncanny ability to be thorough and complete and understandable all at the same time. Because the issue with Jungian psychology that I've found is that there's so many different Jungs you can choose from.
Yeah.
which Jung are we talking about? And you
That's
actually
right.
present it in a way that's like, well, here are the different ways to interpret Jung's ideas. So thank you very much for being here and fantastic job.
Th- Thank you, Ryan. You know, I really appreciate that because there are a lot of different Jungs. And in fact, there were. I mean, Jung's not this unitary phenomenon. There was Carl Jung, and he was this one thing. And I like to look at different interpretations of Jung because they've all got some truth in them. I mean, he was a passionately spiritual man. He was also a guy interested in academic politics, and he would suit his uh, his message to his audience. So on one hand, he really believed in God. On the other hand, I think he really seriously doubted. On one hand, he called himself as he characterized himself as being on the far left of Christianity. On the other hand, he was clearly a Gnostic. And then there are parts of him that just fashion himself as a scientist, pure and simple. And so the question really is, which Jung are we talking about? And I think we're talking about all of them. Like all of us, he was a composite. Yeah,
Absolutely. That's very
yeah.
well said. And given where we left off on our last conversation, where we really established the systemic horror that is going on in our education system, where so many children are carrying that long bag that is our shadow, which Robert Bly so aptly showed us, the long bag we drag behind us. So much of that bag is filled with shit that we didn't, that we experienced in school. Given where we left off, where does your book take us from there?
I try to take the ideas that I've developed in all my previous books. You know, I've written 11 books before this one. I think 12 if you count a second edition of one. And I try to take them and extend them. I think the major way that I attempted in this work, and that I'm going to attempt in another book that I'll be doing with Routledge. This one was with Routledge. The next one will be with Routledge. I think what I'm going to attempt to do there is to move from what I call educational processes to educative acts. Now, what do I mean by that? Educational processes are what goes on in the schools. Um, and that's what I've dealt with. All of Jungian psychology that we can bring to bear upon what goes on in the classroom has been my primary interest. I'm becoming more interested in the world as a classroom. What Moffat speaks about when he talks about the universal schoolhouse, and that all of our interactions are really teaching and learning situations, and we're all teachers and we're all learners at various times. And I want to address education more as a basic fact of our existence than something that's just happening in this educational
Mm.
space. So even in, and by the way, I'm not very computer savvy. So when I'm looking at the screen, should I be looking at you, Ryan, which is what I'm doing now, or looking at me?
Just look straight at the screen, whatever works for you.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I prefer to look at you, and that's the point here.
Either
Um,
way.
if I'm looking at you, I'm in a relationship with you. And I think that the major thing to know about teaching and learning is that it is a relationship. And if it's not a relationship, it's no longer teaching and learning. It's
Mm.
some kind of instruction. It's something mechanical. But if we're engaged in not just rote kinds of acts where I am the one empowered and you are the one trying to glean some of my power, or I'm the one who, as Paulo Freire says, the great Brazilian pedagogue, I'm the one who has all of the capital. I have all of the intellectual capital. You have none. And I'm the bank. And I'm going to give you some of my capital as long as you will obey what I say. And you'll let me know that you're obeying well on tests where you basically give back to me what I said to you. Freire calls that the banking model of education. And I agree with him that that has to be resisted. I'm
Mm.
more interested in the I thou, based upon the Jewish ethicist Martin Buber, whose great book I and Thou in 1965 said that the real essence of ethical behavior, the real essence of morality is that you and I be in an authentic relationship. You know, Ryan, if you and I and what we're doing here, if we are both, I want to say revealing or uncovering or allowing the other in a way that is sacred, in that it is part of your essential life narratives, and I'm doing the same. And we're risking something here, and we're both teaching and we're both learning, and we're both concerned with the growth of the other, and we both know that we enter the conversation fallible. We can be wrong. We have to enter a conversation believing what we believe, or else why the hell do it? It's
Mm,
just polemics then.
mm-hmm.
If or it's false. So I believe what I believe, and you believe what you believe. But we know that everything is, as Sir Karl Popper said, it's all falsifiable. I might be wrong about something. I might be wrong about a lot of things. You too. And if we enter into a conversation in that spirit, then we have an I-thou relationship. Otherwise, it's just the banking model. I, it. You're my object. You're my pedagogical object. I don't
Mm,
care about you especially. You're a number on a Scantron sheet, a standardized test.
mm,
I'm not invested in you, and you're not invested in me, except you need the grade. I hold all the capital. Um, that's what we must move away from, and not only in the classroom with educational processes, but in educative acts.
any
If
form
we
of discourse, you could argue.
any form of discourse, and we're always involved in that. As I say in the book, I use the example that Winnicott uses when he talks about the romance of the nursing couple. From the very beginning, the mother and the child during nursing are involved in educating each other about what this thing called nursing means and how they're going to relate to each other and what the boundaries are and what the possibilities are and what it really means to reflect and be reflected, right up until the moment of death. You know, at 66, I don't walk around dwelling on the fact, but I'm 66 and time is passing awfully fast and faster as I go. And even with increased longevity, there will come a moment in which I am about to depart.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that that's also a teaching and learning act for all of us involved, as we all are trying to shape narratives about what does this mean profoundly.
Mm,
And for me, when we're engaged in that, we're engaged in an educative act. And life is a series of those educative acts. And when it is, then we are deepening our narratives. Our narratives are becoming existentially richer and more spiritualized. And that's ethical. But if we're engaged in relationships where that's not happening and we're objectifying each other, that's not ethical.
mm-hmm.
And so I guess that's an answer to a question that I forgot what it was at this point, because you know me, Ryan,
Let's let it roll.
I'll go on and on. Yes, it's lateral. Is that what you said? Yeah,
Yeah, just going with the flow. That's what's so
go
great
with the
about
flow. That's
podcasts.
yeah.
And it allows that fluid dynamic of relatedness that you just so eloquently spoke to.
Thank you.
It seems to me that what's happening in our society right now, with individuals, is there's a protective mechanism that kicks in, whether it's a political issue or a personal belief, where the insecurity of being challenged or not having good footing leads to this insecure alpha attempt where you then become you're in the bank model that you just talked about.
Right.
It seems to me that a lot of that is driven from a fundamental uncertainty about oneself. What would you add to that? Would you agree with that? Would you rebuttal
I
that?
completely agree with that. I think that's a very good point. And one can't be expected to enter into a relationship right off the bat. There are degrees of intimacy, obviously. You've been my student, I've been your teacher. You've been my teacher, I've been your student in many ways as we interacted, especially when this guy, Ryan Holsapple, shows up in class and I get a load of him the first class with all of these radical ideas, just saying what he means and meaning what he says and not caring if it's politically correct or not.
Right.
Just an absolutely free thinker. I mean, I learned a lot from you about being a teacher. How do I accommodate this man with a lot of views that actually are my own,
Right.
that I might not have been as ready to share with the class as I was after you expressed them.
Right.
You're a fearless character, Ryan, and I really appreciated that. So you've been my teacher too, is my
Thank
point
you.
in this
Yeah.
relationship. Jung spoke, actually not Jung, one of his disciples named Edward Edinger spoke about what he called an ego self-access. And may I say a word about that to
Absolutely.
address your issue? Um, we can't be without our egos. The ego is a necessary structure as we navigate social reality. We must. It's what the social psychologist Irving Goffman called face work. We're all doing face work all the time. We have to, and it's not false. I mean, it doesn't have to be false. I don't know everything about you. You certainly don't know everything about me. We've, if we look at expanding circles, we've come in various circles. So in terms of intimacy and self-revelation and connection with the other, but you're not my son. You're not my wife. You're you're not the friend I've had for 60 years, Frank, whom I met at UC Irvine, and we talk every day for an hour and have for about a half a century with a few breaks. Um, but we're pretty close, Ryan. Well, that means there's still ego stuff going on, but not ego in the sense that I'm trying to colonize you or present a false self, but I'm trying to present the self that's appropriate to the moment. And and so it's something we don't want to do without.
Mm.
We want it to be tied, we want our relationship to be tied in to something that is more centrally meaningful to us. And that's what Jung meant by the self, the capital S, self, almost in the Hindu sense, the eternal self. Now, I believe that we're immortal beings having a mortal experience here. We're not
Mm.
mortal beings with these irrational, immortal pipe dreams that will all amount to nothing at death as we then begin to corrupt into just the grinning skull, and that's all it was ever about. I can't live that way. For me, we're immortal beings having a mortal experience here for various reasons, some of which we know and some of which we frankly don't have a clue about. But when we are more and more in touch with that immortal self, when what you and I do is your ego in touch with your eternal self, and my ego in touch with my eternal self, my social self, my empirical self, my historical sense of myself, my individual self, my psychodynamic issues, that self. I mean that ego. When that is in touch with a higher organizing center, then I can come to you in a really authentic way that is appropriate to the situation, and you can come to it with me. So,
Hmm.
what you want to ask yourself, I think, since you asked me the question, Ryan, in that situation is not, is there an ego operating here? But, is it operating appropriately? Is it allowing my deepest sense of my highest identity to come through? And is it growing? And are Cliff and I doing that together with all of the
Beautiful.
limitations? And if we're doing that, then I think we're having an authentic relationship, and one that is neither. And I know I go on with my answers, Ryan. I'm sorry about that, but
No problem.
if you have a relationship that's just bound by ego, then you're right. Then you're in that kind of anxiety producing relationship when you and I are just presenting what D.W. Winnicott calls the false self to each other. And
Yes.
when that happens, you've got problems. You've got a non-relationship. And a person who lives only in that is neurotic, quite frankly. That's a pretty good definition of neurosis, just no infusion of anything higher than the ego and the persona. On
Hmm.
the other hand, if we're just living in the self, or think we are, we're really often some sort of hippy dippy, and I say that non-aggressively, having been a hippie in the 60s and the 70s, but we're often some sort of hippy dippy la la land of, well, I'm the archetype of this and you're the archetype of that, and we sort of lose, we're not grounded anymore. Major Tom to ground control here. Is there anybody empirically, practically as an adult at home So we don't want that either. We want some sort of interaction. And when we're doing that, then I think then you'll feel more comfortable in relationship.
Absolutely.
To get to the major thrust of your question, yes, we live in a society that is more and more and more commodified, where it's harder and harder to have that kind of I-thou relationship. And I see it in education all the time. And my work is a resistance to that.
Yes, and I think people seem to struggle with authenticity and openness and uncertainty, and we like to have predictability. We like to know. We like to shore things up so that it's stable. We can say what it is. All that stuff. I've Everything you said. I think there's really important points in there. One is this idea, this kind of Jungian idea that I interpret as the ego comes into relationship to the self like a humble worshiper of a great deity. You look to this great higher self, whatever you call it, all the aspects of who you are that are greater than this one moment of awareness, and you make an offering to it, and there's like a real sacred. There's a real sacredness to that in my estimation. Also, sometimes what I wonder about with the word ego is I've struggled with the word ego because I think it's been muddled over the years. First, we have Freud, who says, and you're the experienced one with all this stuff, so you correct me anywhere I go too far afield. But Freud, in my understanding, says ego is the manager. There's the id, there's the superego. I'm the manager as the ego. I got to figure out how to reconcile these two forces and express these instincts in a socially acceptable way. Manager. I mean, I think you could distill it down to something that simple. Jung, my read on Jung's definition of the ego is habitual mode of consciousness. Whatever is the most habituated aspect of the self, whatever we assimilate and express most often, that would be in the ego consciousness. That's my understanding. Then along the way, in New Age thinking, ego is now a dirty word. Your ego is too big. You have an ego.
Right.
Get rid of your ego. I mean, in Latin, the word ego just means self. In
That's
Hinduism, ahamkara, self. It's just the mere fact that I experience an identity as a human being.
That's
then
right.
James Hillman comes along, and he says, norms are just the delusions that parts ascribe to each other, prescribe to each other. I think that's a brilliant quote. And so to some extent, I think ego, in my experience, can be a non-qualitative overgeneralization of actually descriptive habitual states of consciousness. But we don't actually describe, we use ego as kind of an overlay. And Hillman does a great job explaining we have different imaginal states of being. Maybe it's heroic, maybe it's compassionate. I mean, whatever is occurring in this moment as conscious to my experience, you could call ego. So I've been toying with the idea of why not just get rid of the term ego and just describe what is on a moment-to-moment basis. In other words, why do we need this term? And while I can go beyond the word and see that what you just shared is absolutely brilliant, because we need to have a relationship of humility to life and a relationship of connectedness and surrender and all these things. And at the same time, I just wonder about the word ego.
Well, that's a pretty brilliant exposition of ego, with a lot of different views of it and a lot of ideas to respond to. Let me choose a couple of them. You're right. Ego is just the Latin word for I. If you follow it etymologically, it doesn't take too much imagination to imagine how, or to understand how ego becomes the word yo or je in Spanish and French, respectively. Ego morphs phonologically into the word yo, which is also related to I. So really, the ego is just who I am at this present moment. The ego, Jung called the ego a complex, and it's a shifting complex from moment to moment. 10 minutes before this interview, I was talking to my wife, and she was making us some coffee, and I'm not a very good sleeper, and she asked me how I slept, and I was explaining, I didn't get a whole lot of sleep last night. What are you doing today? I don't know. What's your plan for the day? we're talking about a variety of things. And my ego then constellated around that situation. That was my consciousness at that moment.
It's mercurial.
There's nothing more mercurial or less stable, or same thing, than the ego. It's when we become so invested in our ego necessarily being this one thing that we then identify with, and it becomes static and, as we would say, reified. We turn it into a real thing, as if it existed, as if I could say, well, let's do an X-ray, and oh, you see that patch in there, in the hypothalamus, that's the ego. It's nothing like that at all. It is simply well, it was William James, I think, who first said this. It's where our consciousness is crystallizing at any particular moment in any set of circumstances. As long as it stays fluid, and as long as in your interaction with others, you are staying attuned to deeper possibilities, if it's appropriate. Sometimes you're just, buying something at the store.
Mm-hmm.
There's not going to be a lot of I-thou transaction there. Hopefully it'll be polite. But however, I retired about 3 years ago. That was really tough. I didn't realize how much of me was invested in being Dr. Mayes, Professor Mayes. Then I'd go to that same store to buy something, or I'd go to a doctor's appointment and they say, you're up now, Mr. Mayes. The doctor would like to see you. And it was all I could do to stop myself from saying, well, I'm a doctor too. I'm not just Mr. Mayes, I'm Dr. Mayes. Wow. Talk about some really toxic ego there.
Mm-hmm.
And this happens to people a lot when they retire. If they had some sort of status or title and they lose it, the question becomes, who am I? That's an ego that's begun to calcify.
Mm-hmm.
It's like metastatic cells. They're starting to toxically stick together into something that's not very healthy.
Mm.
There you have a different, I guess there's an ego subset 1 and an ego subset 2. And the ego subset 1 is flexible, healthy, careful, giving, cautious, appropriate to the situation, in touch with a higher vision of things and of one's self with a capital S.
Yeah.
The ego that is toxic is not. And that kind of ego, I'm just concerned with how you see me, and it better be as somebody who's more powerful than you are. And it better be, I better have all my degrees constellated. For example, in this image, I better have all my degrees behind me. And you better damn well know who I am.
Right.
However compassionate and loving I may appear to be. That's when the ego starts becoming neurotic, and then you start identifying with it. When you do that, the simple fact is you're identifying with a limited bandwidth of reality. And so you ethically and psychologically and spiritually limit yourself.
Yeah, brilliant. I'd like to explore what you just said, and I'd like to explore it from a lens of subpersonalities, and I want to see how you think of this. So, everything you just said, in my estimation, could be replaced with psychodynamics via the lens of subpersonality. So, for example, I have a part. Let's say we're all made up of various parts, various selves. And you could argue that they have archetypal antecedents. You could argue that these selves go back phylogenetically, way back into history.
And you do that, by the way, in a presentation you gave. You should mention the name of that presentation, Ryan. That is so good.
I would, except for now I have such better information that makes my argument even more concise. That
send me that.
I would not refer to the old one anymore, because
will you send me your new product whenever it comes out?
Yeah, I can send you my most current understanding of genetics and personality.
Okay,
so basically, we could argue that psychodynamics are constellated from various different subpersonalities that have different feelings, urges, motivations.
Absolutely.
That's all there is, in my estimation. And consciousness, which is like the soul, and then the self is the collection of all the little selves. It's the sum that is greater than the It's the whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, as they say in Gestalt.
Right.
So therefore, let's take the hypothetical situation you just described, and I'm going to totally project onto it, not because it's accurate, but just for the sake of an example. So let's say the doctor retires and no longer feels secure. Well, the question to me then would be, what part of me feels not secure? I wouldn't call it ego. I would say, well, maybe there's a young child in me that's now feeling scared because I don't have a protective identity. Or maybe there's a controller in me that feels out of control and needs to get control of my life. In any particular event, instead of using the word ego, I think we could use descriptive, qualitative statements about the parts of us that are active. And then we avoid a term that has become so convoluted that it no longer describes what is. It then refers to abstract generalizations. And so I could say, well, the young boy in me is afraid, and then the controller reacts to the young boy and starts controlling and trying to calcify my identity or grab onto something else. And then all of a sudden we have a deeply individuated understanding of ourselves, rather than a more of an abstract language. And that's where I'm coming from. And I want to go back to what you said at the beginning with the Karl Popper, the falsifiability. I'm just sharing with you how I understand psychodynamics. I'm not saying that I have a corner on this. I'm just saying this is the conclusion I've come to for myself. And I'd love to hear how that lands for you.
Oh, I just think that's wonderful. I think what you just said is, as usual, Ryan, filled with so many good ideas. I mean, I know I can be a bit excessive in my praise. I know that. That's the kind of teacher I am. But I really do see the things I see when I'm saying what I say. And it's so fun to do these interviews with you because it's like having Holzapfel in class again. And you're the kind of, when I was at a university, brick and mortar for 30 years, you're the kind of student you're the kind of student that professors fight over to have as a doctoral student. Being the chairman of a doctoral program is a hell of a lot of work, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And when a student comes to you and says, will you be my chair? Well, you've got to do it. And you sort of dig in because it's going to be a whole lot it's very labor intensive and you don't get an extra cent for it. Boy, with you, I would have fought for you as a doctoral.
Well, I really,
you're
flattering me.
I am, but I absolutely mean every damn word. So is that flattering? No, I think I'm just reflecting.
Thank you.
Somebody we don't study, and it is 1,000 pities. He's every bit as good as Jung. If I were stranded on the moon, and I could only bring one set of works by a psychologist, it might be Jung, and it might be Roberto Assagioli. I bet you've never heard of Assagioli.
Spell it for me. I got to write this down.
Well, I think I can do the spelling right off the bat. I always have to look it up when I'm writing about him. And his premier disciple, Paolo Ferrucci. Assagioli, I think, is Assagioli. Gosh, let me look in
that's close enough for Google.
Yeah, but let me get it right. I mean, I can look in my the index of my book.
Sure.
My latest book. To make sure that's right. Anyway, yeah, that's close enough for Google. But to get it just right, it's Assagioli.
Yep, I think that's what you said. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
So Assagioli was an Italian psychiatrist of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I think, something like that. Maybe he wrote into the 70s. We don't study him. He's talked about exactly what you just said. He said he's the one who introduced the idea of subpersonalities. That's right. And it's his a disciple, Paolo Ferrucci, which I think is 2 R's and 2 C's, but I'm not sure. Anyway, you'll find it. Ferrucci, I don't know. Who said everybody is a crowd. We're all a crowd. And each of these sub-personalities, said Ferrucci, is archetypal. He got very deeply into the theory of archetypes concomitantly with Jung. I don't think he was, I don't know if any work has been done on this. I don't think he was affected by Jung any more than Jung might have been affected by him.
Right.
Assagioli is the person to go to about this. And the whole purpose of what his school of psychology and psychiatry, which is called psychosynthesis, is about, is what Jung is talking about, is integrating all of these personalities.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So that one is the complex being that one is. And, uh, uh, you know, uh, in the morning, you're an athlete, you're a student, you're a citizen. In the afternoon, you're a student, you're a fellow traveler with somebody ideologically in your cohort. In the evening, you're a companion, a lover, a friend, a party goer. I mean, and there are shadow sides to this as well. For the proactive me, there is the profoundly depressed me.
Yes.
It doesn't want to even move. On the other hand, there's that part of me that's in search of the eternal self.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all parts of us that are always operating.
Yes.
And so if we don't, one of the real problems that I've said for a long time that psychosynthesis should be brought to the schools is that adolescents are developing their personality, but they have many subpersonalities. And when I've done counseling with them, the first question or the first statement is, I think I'm going crazy because I'm like about 6 different persons. And my response is, well, welcome to adulthood.
Yes.
That's what we all are, and more than that even. And so the idea is to let them all have voice, and sometimes some of them have to shut the hell up.
Yes.
Just go sit down in the corner and be an adult, or not. Come out to the middle of the dance floor and be a kid again. But yes, so I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and it is a question of bringing the subpersonalities together in such a way that the ego that is presenting itself to the world is an authentic reflection of that within appropriate social bounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that describes it really well. And I wasn't aware of Assagioli's work on subpersonalities. I've followed from Gestalt therapy and genetic research, and my mentor, Dr. Strachan, who has created his own adaptive theory on personality.
He's wonderful. I've watched those videos. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah. He's very tenacious, and he would a lot of the stuff that professors and people put forth. He's just a nightmare to be around because he's like a pit bull. Once he locks onto something, he's not very compromising. But that's also what has made him a great mentor, because we wrestle around with ideas. And I've come to see a lot of things his way, and I've come to adapt and have my own views. But that's the nature of mentoring.
If you really respect the person you're mentoring, I am awfully tough on my doctoral students. I mean, I am hell on wheels, but it's because if I've taken them on, I believe in them. So it really is a high form of flattery. Talk about flattery.
Yes.
You're constantly being challenged by him. If you weren't, he would either think, quite frankly, you don't have that kind of academic future.
Yes.
You need to wrestle with these things, or he doesn't want to waste his time.
Right.
So that's a real compliment.
Well, thank you. And so, but basically, with this mercurial aspect of the psyche, where we shift in and out of attentional awareness with different parts of us, if we were going to use the word ego, which I still, for me, not sure if I'll use it in my writing or not going forward. At this point, I'm leaning towards not necessary, although I can respect other people who choose to. At this point, if we were to use the word ego, we might say it is the fixed point of which we are identified with in this moment. And we are, and the persona side of that would be the way that that's being expressed in public, or the way that that's publicized in some way.
Yes.
What I worry about is then if people start losing track of qualitative descriptions rather than,
absolutely,
that's my concern, basically.
And that is so important. And I am trying to find something in my book where I address this. I'm looking at the index, which I wrote, but I can't find the exact quote. In a letter that Jung wrote to a Protestant pastor, I guess the pastor had asked, I forget which letter it was. It was in the 60s, I think, that Jung wrote this. So it was near the end of his life. The pastor asked him, well, what is the psyche?
Mm.
And his response was, I have no idea. He said, I don't know. He said, picture, I remember he said this, picture picture a physicist. He'll talk about atoms and valences and shells and this and that, realizing full well all along that he's just presenting a theoretical construct. If we start talking about the ego as this thing that exists, and the subpersonalities as things that exist,
Mm-hmm.
and repression as a thing that exists, and individuation as a real process that somehow exists, then we have reified it from the Latin res, thing.
Mm.
We've turned it into a concrete thing. It's not. It's the word we use. It's the best guess for an ongoing process.
Right.
And so, although, as you know, I'm no real fan of postmodernism, I'm pretty classical in my beliefs. You know, I'm pretty
Mm-hmm.
much a Western canon kind of guy. I just am, and I'm a pretty classical Jungian. I think the postmodernists are onto something here when they say that when we use various theories and constructs and terms, we're always, when we're writing them, we have to write under erasure. You know, I'm going to use this term, but I'm willing to erase it if you've got a better term. I'm willing to erase
Amen.
it because I realize it's just a term. We are just using words. There's a scene in Hamlet where Polonius, who's out to capture, trick Hamlet into one corner or another, finds Hamlet alone in the library reading. He's got his book. It's that famous scene where Hamlet's in the reading.
Mm.
And Polonius says to him, "What is it you read, my lord?" And Hamlet responds, "Words, words, words."
Mm.
And that's all we have. And they're very poor things. And they're counters. They commemorate an experience, or they try to constellate or anticipate an experience, but they are not the experience itself. The
Yeah.
experience, I would say, and this is a good definition of an archetype, and Jung uses it, an experience is something that is both pre-verbal and transverbal. It is both primordial and transcendent. That's what an archetype is. It is a primordial experience of something fundamental to who we are as a species. And
Mm-hmm.
it is something that we long for, I would argue, transcendentally, in
Yes.
another realm of being that we're being prepared for in my
Beautiful.
view. You don't have to take that view. Well, thank you. That's one way of looking at it. The words that we use, as they become more and more real, also in a way become more and more tenuous and tentative because we understand that they are just words.
Mm-hmm.
My next book, I'm thinking, might be um, a Jungian exegesis of the Gospel of St. John. There really hasn't been a good thing done on that. There was one thing done by Reverend Sanford, which was very good, but it was basically pastoral, not so theoretical. Well, I'm a guy who's interested in those kinds of issues, but I've come to find the word God absolutely useless.
Right.
It's a theoretical construct. What the hell do I mean, or what do you mean? And the same thing when we say ego. We are, with our words, I think it was Flaubert and Madame Bovary.
Mm-hmm.
Flaubert wrote, with our words, something like, we beat drums to try to make bears dance, whereas in fact we want to move the stars.
Yes.
And so those are words. They're poor things. And I think you're wise not to. There is a difference between, as I point out in archetype culture and the individual, a difference between experience and reason. Reason is very important. It is a product of the cognating, the ratiocinating, the logical, secondarily, syllogistically processing mind. Woohoo, that's great stuff. But that's a secondary process, as we
Right.
say in depth psychology. It is not the primary process. The primary process is everything that's going on. That's your bedrock. And then the words form on top of that, and we use them.
And mostly post hoc.
mostly post hoc and very often in a way that really betrays the
Yes,
experience.
absolutely. Yeah, and
And
there's
this is why Heidegger said in Was heißt das Denken? What is thinking? That that really, really, the truest language is poetry. It is in poetry that language is closest to its originary meaning. It's in
yes,
logical statements that we get farther away from real meaning. So, in arguing for education as archetypally rich, I'm arguing for education as experience. So is
wow,
Dewey, by the way. That was,
yes,
our artist, Dewey was constantly saying that. The curriculum must be rooted in the student's experience. And then
beautiful.
the things that we hypothesize about and the words we use and the theories we construct are all well and good and important, but they are secondary.
Yes,
So
secondary.
I know I went off on a digression there, but I think it sort of comes back to your point that you want to be true to the experience and you don't want to get lost in the verbiage of it.
Yes, and what
You
you're
want to
saying
find,
reminds me of
yeah,
the finger pointing to the moon is not
is
the
not the
moon, right?
moon. That's
That's
right.
a lot of people know that saying. However, what I would add to all the brilliant insights you just had is I also feel that some fingers are now pointing away from the moon, and we need to we need to adjust so that they're
Yeah,
pointing. So, in other words, yes, language. I agree absolutely that language is so limited in its capacity to explain the phenomenology. And at the same time, some language is actually more descriptively adequate and
that's right.
closer. So it's not that not all words are created equal, and not all sentence structures are equally descriptive of what is. And so I do think it's important, as people who create theories or discuss theories, that we actually we're able to change our terms as needed, and like you said, stand corrected.
Absolutely. I gave an address at Southern Utah University a couple of years ago on um, how can we do accomplish what you're talking about, and I used to quote as the organizing mechanism for my address from Eliot: "Where's wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?"
Mm-hmm.
And now we use words basically to convey information with very little wisdom involved. And when we use words in a sense that attempts to capture the wisdom of the culture, what has accrued over 500 or 2,000 years, we don't have, rather, when we use that to convey knowledge rather, there's no
Mm.
wisdom in it. It is simply academic discourse.
Yep.
Where, when discourse is oriented around an attempt for both of us to come into living contact with wisdom, then we've used information and knowledge for their real purposes and kept them secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Primary thing, which is this wisdom you're talking about, I make a lot in my book of the difference between what I call um, education in the I call it training in the service of the sign
Wow.
versus education in the spirit of the symbol.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Oh, thank you, Ryan.
Symbol meaning that which opens up to more possibilities,
Absolutely.
sign meaning that which closes down to one possibility. Is that correct?
That is exactly right.
Yeah.
When you see the little curved S in calculus, the integral, that means evaluate this integral. And I don't particularly care how you feel about the integral and evaluating it, the area under the surface. Just evaluate the damn thing. And there is a procedure for doing it.
Right.
And basically follow that procedure.
Yes.
Um, um, when you come to a stop sign, um, there's not a lot of concern for how you feel about it. A stop sign means one thing and one thing only. That's what makes a good sign.
Right.
One-on-one. There's a one-on-one correspondence. Now, take that and compare it to a line from Eliot. Um, I will I think this is in The Wasteland, where he says, "I will show you fear in a handful of dust."
Mm.
That's a symbol. What does he mean, a handful of dust? I mean, all kinds of resonances
It opens
arise.
up. Yeah.
It opens up. It is multivalent. It it applies to the intuition. It involves my emotions. It involves my hopes and my fears. It
Mm.
calls into question who I am. It brings me into relationship with the poet. It is the primordial language, primordial in the sense of the original. That's what Elio Vivas said, that that the original people spoke to each other in poetry, he said.
Oh,
And it's only as we degenerate more and more into an object-governed society that our language must always be objective. Now,
mm,
we now juxtapose something that is objective as opposed to subjective. Objective good, subjective bad. Objective true, subjective false.
yeah. And we
Not
can
what it
trace
means.
that back to that Cartesian dualism, of
That
course.
dualism.
Which, by the
Uh, uh,
way, I mean, is Heidegger brilliant or what? I mean, I
oh
just
yeah,
started reading Heidegger this past December, November, and the being in time
yep, that's it. That's the
radically
work.
transformed my understanding of what it is to be human. I mean, his phenomenology is just brilliant, and to
It
combine
is.
that with Jungian theory, whew, I
Oh,
mean, the
you've got your
possibilities
dissertation.
are limitless.
You've got your dissertation.
Yeah,
You really
that's
do.
a really good idea.
Oh, you've got your, Ryan will talk about that. You've got your dissertation right there. I don't think there's a lot been done on Jung and Heidegger. You know, Heidegger asked the great Bill Clinton question. It all depends on the meaning of is, right?
Right, right, right.
But that's what Heidegger says when we use the copulative verb be, or it's implicit. What does that mean? What is the meaning of is? And that's the question. If I say he is good or he is bad, or he is a Republican or he is a Democrat or he is this or that, we can wonder about those things that we predicate.
Right,
But what is the is part of it? What is it? What does it be to be? What does
right,
it be to be?
right,
And as Heidegger said, it is in poetry that we come closer to that, because the poet is using words directly out of the experience
right,
of the moment and in touch with reality as such, and the words come out of that. The
right,
words are the words are not an attempt to control reality. The words are shaped by reality as it is presenting itself in that moment.
right,
And therefore the words that come out tend to be images and symbols. And that's the difference. A symbol is open-ended,
yep,
intuitive, and it it brings us to meaning, whereas a sign does not bring us to meaning. A sign is a statement of an objective fact. And let's break that word down for a moment. Objective simply means it's a statement about an object.
yep,
Something that is subjective doesn't mean false. It means it's a statement about the subject. You and me. Something is subjective only because it is about your experience and my experience. And that is not less important than this. You know, the fact that something falls 32 feet per second is an objective fact.
right,
The fact that it's going to fall on my car and destroy the car, and all of my feelings about that, and my feelings about cars in general, and the American auto industry, and modern American capitalism, and trouble I've been having with my car, and the association of car with a certain kind of masculinity, and the death of and what's happening in the rest of all these associations,
mm,
and Henry Ford, and the fact that he was a racist and anti-Semitic, and I'm Jewish, and I mean, you know, though that's the subjective part,
right.
idea of 32 feet per second per
Well,
second, and
that's how we experience life. We don't
that's
experience
how we experience
facts.
life.
We
No,
don't.
we don't.
Yeah,
We don't
and
really.
Heidegger does a brilliant job, laying that out. I mean, in such a. I mean, reading Heidegger is hilarious because it's like, yeah, I consider myself a decently intelligent person, and then it's
Oh,
like, what in the world did this man just say? You
yeah.
gotta really. I mean,
The
some
pre the
sentences are so profound and also confusing. You're like, whoa, I need to
like
steal
the
this one.
my favorite one of my favorite sentences from Heidegger is the pre-ontological analytic of the subjectivity of the subject.
Right, right.
There you go. I love that one. Gosh, all I need is a beer
Thanks.
and a bowl of popcorn and a football game, and to be
Right,
thinking about it, I'm good.
right.
Uh, and here's another thing about Heidegger. And boy, I don't mean to burst your balloon, but something to think about. I've had to struggle with it a lot. Heidegger was, well, I don't want to go off on, he was the rector of a German university.
Hmm.
Oh, my battery is not, I see my battery's about to go out. Oh, I'm unplugged. Just a second.
Let's
Let me
see if you
plug
can
in.
rescue it.
Oh, I can't. I have 16 minutes of life. There we go.
There you go.
I have a new
You're
lease
in.
on life. At my age, always a good thing.
You're in.
Um, there was a church that I was involved with once, and the leader of the church was asked, what is the secret to your longevity? And he said, well, I try to make it a policy to wake up every morning. So I know,
There you go.
I love that. Um, here's the thing about it. Let's look about Heidegger as a symbol.
Yep.
Heidegger's Being Time is my favorite philosophy text. There's no question about it.
Oh, I'm so
I
glad to
think
hear.
he's the quintessence of 20th century philosophy. There's no way you can't end run Heidegger. You can go through him and not like him or whatever, but you can't end run Heidegger. Um, he was the rector. I forget which university. I want to say Marburg, but I think that
Yeah.
may be where he was born. He was the rector of that university during the Third Reich.
Yeah.
And I think the Nuremberg trials have a Nazi sympathy scale that goes from like 0 to 2, or
Mm,
complicity scale. Heidegger was a 2.
right.
I have a
I'm
friend.
aware about this a little
Oh,
bit.
you're aware of that. And I have a, oh, good. So I'm not,
Well, I'd like
I
to
go,
address it after you're done explaining it. I think it's important.
oh, it is an important question. I mean, to a certain extent, in order just to function, you had to do that. He never apologized for it,
No,
which is,
I don't actually know if Heidegger was a good person.
yeah,
That was what I was gonna bring. I mean, but I didn't want to cut you off. Did you have more
no,
to say about the issue?
no. Well, yeah, I mean, and then again, his lover, Hannah Arendt, was a Jewish woman. She was a great historian. Unlike Jung, who did have a brief association with a Nazi psychiatric journal, which he edited for a while, profusely apologized. He called it die größte Dummheit meines Lebens, the biggest stupidity of my entire life.
Jung said that?
Yeah, die größte Dummheit meines Lebens. He was, and many of his followers were Jewish, and that I don't know one that didn't immediately and fully forgive him. But Heidegger never had another word to say about it.
And you said who was this errant woman? Was this his?
Hannah Arendt, Arendt. She wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism,
But
in
she
which
was in relationship with Heidegger?
she was his lover.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah,
Got it. Got it.
and she's another interesting story. Um, may I digress in the digression just a bit about Hannah
Abs-
Arendt, and then I'll be done with that.
Please.
Hannah Arendt, as I think as a Jewish historian, wanted to know what was at the essence of this Reich that we all just got over, and that exterminated half of my people. What as a historian, what conclusion can I come to? What is the evil? What can I isolate so that it doesn't happen again, or at least we can be aware of it? And you know what she found that would the motivating force at the core of Hitler's inner circle, and with Hitler himself, she felt
Mm,
boredom.
you're kidding.
Boredom. Boredom is the origin of totalitarianism, and it really ties into the idea of sign and symbol. Our lives become boring when they are de-symbolized, when nothing means anything but the simple fact of what it is, when everything is just a one-on-one correspondence, when nothing gives out
Yep.
onto broader landscapes, emotionally rich, spiritually resonant, um, metaphysically hopeful, um, containing within itself like contradictions, like Whitman says, I am multitudes of people.
Mm,
Or getting back to Asagioli to try to use this to synthesize things. When we are living in a world in which A is only A and never anything but A, and an entirely objective world, to the extent that the world becomes entirely objective, we tend towards the total state, where something only means what the state says it means. And damn it, there is no, the first people that Hitler came to get were not the communists, were not the Jews necessarily, were not gay people. The first people that were rounded up were the comedians.
mm,
Comedians posed the most immediate threat to the totalitarian state because they problematize everything and show the contradictions that you and I live in and that we are. The
yes.
total state nothing is funny. And that's why political correctness worries me so much.
It's
I mean, it's
dangerous,
funny
and
anymore.
now you see comedians getting criticized all the time,
Right.
which makes us wonder where we're headed, right?
Yeah. If
But I would
nothing's,
add to
yeah.
your statement, boredom in the way that Hannah Arendt is using it seems
Arendt
to
is the way
be
I've always said it. I don't know. That's
Arendt.
my pronunciation.
It seems to be that boredom and nihilism are closely
They are.
connected in that statement.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm completely of the mind, um, as someone who's done a lot of counseling with folks. I have a doctorate in psychology, in addition to a doctorate in education. So I wear kind of two hats, as you know.
Yep.
And one thing I've found, um, in counseling, in working with substance abuse, I'm constantly struggling with smoking. I've been a smoker all my life,
Mm.
and kicking that is something I do, and then I go back and I think, what is that? I mean, it's a very tough substance. So I'm speaking. I'm not preaching here. I'm speaking from the front row seats of the damned when it comes to addiction. What is addiction? Addiction is, I think, a response to boredom. We talk about getting high. We talk about going on a trip. Trips are things we take to get away from the ordinary humdrum reality.
Mm.
A substance abuse isn't, and it is a false form of spirituality. We do talk about getting high and going on a trip. What do we talk about alcohol as spirits? So when life is de-symbolized, de-archetypalized, overly objectified, and too objective, and when we're caught in this calcified ego that is reified as a thing,
Yes.
in an educational system that standardizes us with objective tests, with no room for the variation and the malleability and the rich subjective and spiritual and ethical life of the student, we are on a short path to totalitarianism. It is, as Hayek says, or was it Bastian? I think Hayek. It is the road to serfdom.
Wow. I really just have to highly recommend your new book.
Thank you.
For a couple of reasons. One is the way that you write is amenable to or amicable to entry level. So I believe, I'm not saying it's simple or it's easy. I'm saying that it can be done. If you just want, you haven't read anything about Jung or depth psychology, Dr. Mayes here will not leave you hanging. In my experience, he explains what he's talking about, and not only does he explain it, he explains it better than other writers are explaining it. For example, not only does he introduce the term archetype, he introduces the 7 different ways that archetype is interpreted by the field, and by people who came after Jung. So I think it's a really important learning adventure to read this book, because it will be thorough, and it will explain things, and it will be a good educational experience, and you might be better educated than you would if you picked up another book on Jungian psychology. So that's my
Before you go on, thank you, Ryan. I want to shamelessly put in a plug for another book of mine that I think does that. It's an introduction to the collected works of C.G.
Yep,
Jung,
I've got that one.
Psyche of Spirit, and that's by Roman and Littlefield. And there was a review of it in the Journal of Analytic Psychology, and the reviewer pointed out that my work and the work of Murray Stein probably those are the 2 best authors for becoming introduced to Jung.
I agree.
So I try to do it, but also this other book of mine could be used in a doctoral level seminar. So I try to do that, Ryan. I try to do that with a book. To make it something that could be used with upper division undergraduates who are, who know some terms in psychology, or have done some reading along these lines, not a great deal necessarily, or a doctoral student doing a dissertation could quote from this book. So thank you, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and there's going to be when I post this podcast, there will be a link to the Amazon page to buy your book in the description, both of them.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So, do you have another minute before we close?
However long you think is appropriate, I'm there.
So here's where I I kind of want to leave things with this open-ended
Okay.
question, and I want to maybe hear your response as we close here. So we have you lay out in your new book, archetype, culture, and the individual in education. Did I get that right?
And the subtitle, which is important because it's the three pedagogical narratives. And in my concluding remark, I'll try to fold that in.
Okay, great. So early on in the book, you lay out seven, I believe, seven different ways that archetype has been
I think I
interpreted.
do, yeah.
Um, and I was very pleased that you include the biological arguments, Anthony Stevens and other people who have looked at the kind of phylogenetic dispositional nature of archetype. And we look back at Jung's writing. I mean, he uses the word disposition, he uses the word heritable, he uses the word inheritable, all referring to collective unconscious. So he clearly, and he uses biology, he refers to it, he clearly saw some sort of genetic component going on, something. I mean,
No question.
that's my reading of it. Here's my problem. And I don't even think Anthony Stevens gets it right in his Archetype Revisited book. I think he misses the point. That he gets a lot of points, but I think he misses a really important one. There are no two human beings alike. There is no such thing as a universal collective genetic. 99% of us as human beings are similar because that's how many genes we share, or that's the percentage of genetics we share, excuse me. But the 1% is what makes us different in terms of our physiological and psychogenetic composition that goes on to develop in the environment, in the niche, in how we respond and how we grow. So how can we, and Jung acknowledged this. He says, insofar as every human being is born with a unique brain, a unique disposition, and in more articulate words than this, he says every human being is going to meet their life with very distinct attributes. So, okay, so how can we have it both ways, Dr. Jung? How can we have a universally inherited collective unconscious where everything's identical and at the same time have a unique dispositional archetypal substrate? So I think the research is pretty conclusive. You look at twin studies over the last 40 years, Dr. Robert Plowman, Kevin Mitchell, a lot of people who are looking at the research of personality and genetics are saying it really does matter what we come in with as far as what accounts for the differences between people. And so to call it archetypal in the sense that it's universal, if let's say I have a strong trait of compassion or a high volume of aggression within me, to call that an archetype that's universal seems to me to overestimate how we share things and underestimate how we differ with what we inherit and what is heritable. And so I think that archetypal theory and Jungian psychology faces a distinct danger. And that danger is the science of modern genetics is now demanding, in my opinion, that we change universalization of archetypes, or else Jung's theory has been debunked. That's my personal opinion.
I'm sorry, I was multitasking while you were talking, but I heard what you said. I was trying to find some of Jung's wonderful quotes on the individual. If I had the manuscript on the screen, I could do search and find them.
Well, I've got some of them right on my computer too. If you want me to pull them up.
Sure. I mean, if that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I know for a fact he says the individual is the sole reality.
That's right. He said one book I've wanted to write, it wouldn't be a very popular book and it would take years to research, and I've got other plans, but would be a book entitled Jung the Conservative. Yeah. Jung was extremely conservative.
Right.
And he believed that anything that veers away, to the extent that something veers away from focusing upon the individual,
mm-hmm.
It is going off into an abstraction that does not, as he puts it, we must nurture this delicate plant individuality.
Yes.
That's one of the quotes. One of my favorite quotes from Jung, and I think you might have this up on your list, is the individual alone bears reality.
That's a beautiful. I'm not sure where that one is.
Yeah,
What volume that's in.
I could look it up,
No,
in
we
my
don't have to. We
office,
don't
but
have to provide that at the moment.
we don't have to provide it. Another one is that he said in conversation, well, he was no fan of statistics, that's for sure. And he said,
Mhm.
well, statistics, he said, as soon as you start talking about statistics, you can throw psychology right out the window. That's a direct quote.
Mhm.
Quite the opposite of the approach now.
Right.
I mean, a doctorate in psychology now is 60% statistics courses.
Right.
Jung
Right.
also said statistics, to the extent that a statistic is a statistic, it is precisely not about any particular individual.
That's right. That's really important. It doesn't say anything about individuals. It says something about averages, and that can be applied to theories on the individual, but cannot directly say anything about an individual.
It's not the individual.
Right.
That's why I say there are three narratives in education: the individual narrative, the cultural narrative, and the archetypal narrative. And having those three interact so that the individual maintains his or her individuality. You're not subsumed under any cultural or cultural category, nor are you fully explained by being an archetype. People show up at parties. Well, I'm essentially the prince archetype or the explorer archetype.
Right.
Well, that's fun for a party, but no, you're
Right.
not just that. That is to reify. You are, and this is where the existentialists got it absolutely right. I think it's 1,000 pities we don't read the existentialists anymore. The great existential motto is that existence precedes essence.
Yes.
Who
Sartre.
who
Right.
Ryan? Yeah, that's right. Who Ryan Holsinger is as an individual precedes any essential thing, any category I could apply to you.
Yep.
And all of our educational acts, our interactions, our institutional acts must always keep the individual in mind. And when we lose sight of the individual and things become more and more objectified and categorized, if we lose the individual's narrative, again, we are on the road to serfdom.
And that's basically my issue with theories that posit groups as having identities.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think group identities are a thing in and of themselves. I think they're an epiphenomenon of individuals who coalesce on the
That's what you
principle of
said.
mutual interests. Yeah.
You might have the quote from Jung where Jung says there is no such thing as a culture. There's simply a lot of individuals.
Damn it, he says that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'll
I
find
wish I
all
would have
these
had that
quotes.
because I just wrote a whole paper on some
Oh,
issues that I have with cultural complex theory. If I would have had that quote, I could have nailed them.
I could find it for you.
It's too
Jung
late now.
was
I already
a.
submitted it. Oh
Oh
God.
well, I'll find these quotes for you though, and
My
they're all
teachers
somebody.
suffer me because half of my papers are just arguing with things that I don't find applicable.
Well, let's face it, Ryan. One of the things that first
I'm
struck me about you,
insufferable.
No, you're not. No, you're not. One of the first things that struck me about you is what's also true of me is that there's a very strong libertarian bent,
Right.
and I, we do find ourselves to a large extent within our cultural narratives.
Yep.
You can't ignore those as an educator or a psychologist. In sitting down to do counseling with a couple, for example, if they come from very different cultures, I want to know about that right to begin with, because that's going to be a salient feature. But my other point is that in my view, a cultural narrative, a foundational narrative, is the way an originary group of individuals confronted God.
Mm.
And though that confrontation, that engagement becomes encoded in the foundational narratives, which then become the basis of social interaction. And not
Mm.
only that, but the law. The law is just the codification and abstract terminology of the lessons inherent in our founding myths.
Yep. Yep.
But Jung would always argue that, remember, that as powerful as those cultural myths are, and as important as they are in terms of a people's original confrontation with the divine, that at the root of it all is the individual and her or his experience.
Yes.
And then when that is not the case anymore, then political discourse veers off into polemical general statements that at the individual level are so destructive
Right.
and counterintuitive.
Yes. Yeah. Very well said.
So it's bringing the individual narrative, the cultural narrative, and the archetypal sacred narrative together as an interactive whole. That's the way to go in
Yes.
terms of education and therapy, I think. And
Yeah.
that will never be done with statistics, and it'll never be done just with models of the mind. These are important things, but they are distinctly secondary to the individual's experience of reality, and particularly the sacred in reality that constellates as the symbols that move her or him forward in life.
Absolutely.
And offer a hopeful narrative.
And
That's
this is why, for me, being a phenomenologist is never going away from me. That's got to be one of my deepest ontological commitments.
Right.
And at the same time, accounting for scientific findings, accounting for the best data that we have, and how that attributes to causal phenomenological experiences, to the roots of things, I think I don't think it's one way or the other. I think we can have both ways.
We absolutely can.
But I'd like to just read some quotes here from Jung and present sort of a succinct case on what I'm trying to say here. And then I want to get your closing comments, and then we'll get out of here.
That's great. I would like to preface your reading by saying that there are these bifurcated camps in Jungian psychology. Polyisodrath Jung. Everything is just a cognitive construct. That's all an archetype is. Well, no, it's not that. On the other hand, we have the radical classical Jungians. We can't talk about cognition or science or biology at all. We are a spiritual discourse. Well, you know what? You better have some evidence and some cognitive constructs.
Yep.
These things, it's a false dichotomy.
Thank you for that's brilliant. Okay, so here's a quote from Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious.
Okay.
Starting now. It is, in my view, a great mistake to suppose the psyche of a newborn child is a tabula rasa, in the sense that there is absolutely nothing in it. Insofar as the child is born with a differentiated brain that is predetermined by heredity and therefore individualized, it meets sensory stimuli coming from outside, not with any aptitudes, but with specific ones. And this necessarily results in particular individual choice and a pattern of apperception. So this quote's really interesting to me because now it has been validated by the most updated research on genetics and personality, and how genes wire brains, and brains come into the world not just passively assimilating the environment, but actively accommodating and even selecting for experiences and triggering other people's dispositional traits to interact with. That's really interesting. Now, where it gets weird is that Jung also says, here, I'll find the quote here. Just give me a second. Basically, what he argues is that the inheritance of the collective unconscious is absolutely universal. And I think I alluded to this a few minutes ago. What I struggle with is, okay, so if complexes, meaning charged psychological states of disturbance or energized states, are constituted of an archetypal core. Okay, got it. But if we also know that innate disposition is what drives our responses, how can we have it both ways? I struggle with this. I don't think we can. I don't think we can say that there's a universalism underneath human behavior, and at the same time there's an individual. I think it has to be stated that we share a lot of things and we don't share a lot of things from the very beginning, from the moment we're born. And I wonder if Jung might have been struggling with this. I mean, you're more learned on Jung than I am. And I wonder if he might have been struggling with this, because I find statements where he says it's all individual apperception and how apperception and how we interact with the environment. And at the same time, I find universalism, which, people like Jacobi or the Whitmont have gone on to write about complexes and how it's important to understand the universal archetypal core of it. But it's like, I don't believe it's universal. I believe it's unique. I believe it's that's what is proven in our most current scientific research on individual human beings. And yeah, do we share a lot because we're human? Absolutely. Is that going to make it easier to understand patterns of behavior and different psychodynamics that occur throughout social structures and family dynamics? Absolutely. And at the same time, does that mean that it's all the same and that it all goes back to the same structure? I don't think it's possible to be so.
Oh, yours is the classical dilemma in philosophy between the Aristotelian and the Platonic view. It's called the difference between realism and nominalism.
Mm.
And Plato said that when we see specific things, like I see a book here, I understand that it's a book because there is such thing as a universal archetype of book that exists in some other realm of being, and it is really real.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the individual instance is but an instance of a more general category.
Mm.
That's the archetypal. On the other hand, so that's realism.
Yes.
On the other hand, you have the Aristotelian view that, no, we have the word book, but that's only because we've encountered 20,000 books in our lives. Specific, there's only the specific. If we use the word book in a general way, it's just code, it's shorthand for every specific instance we've seen. So which is real? Is the abstract general category real, or is the particular case the real thing? And I think that those are I call it in my book, I have a whole section in the book called The Double Concerto of Western Philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Western philosophy is really a moving back and forth in the dialectic between Aristotle and Plato. Really, Western philosophy it's just basically playing out the Aristotelian Platonic dilemma. And so you are in the midst of that question. And I would say, along with Yogi Berra, when you come to a fork in that road, take it.
Yes.
Yes. You have to go both ways.
Yes.
So I would say both things are true.
Yeah, because there must be something essential about the universe. Otherwise, nothing could have sparked creation in the first place. And at the same time, there must be something adaptive and non-conforming to the universe. Otherwise, there'd be no evolution possible. I mean, the way evolution happens is that things change, things adapt, new creations emerge. I mean, so I think you're right. We have to hold both somehow.
Somehow. And Jung was trying to hold a lot of tensions, and that leads to some contradictions in his work. Also, if someone put together 18 volumes of the collected work of Ryan Holsapple, by the time you're 65 years old,
oh, no.
There are going to be a lot of contradictions in there.
You're not kidding.
We're speaking to different audiences, and we're at different stages of our own development, or
I agree.
we did or didn't have heartburn that day, or we
Very
had
well said.
And so thank you. And so also Jung was very politically savvy. This was an ambitious man. You don't become a figure like Carl Jung if you haven't played your cards right, generally speaking.
Right.
There are academic politics, professional politics, and so he spoke to different groups of people and didn't say what they wanted to hear, but would emphasize different facets of his general thought in order best to accommodate a particular audience. So you can always find something in Jung that contradicts another position about Jung. But I would say, in general, and this is what I try to attempt to deal with in my book, we are dealing with the individual in the context of world historical cultural narratives and sacred narratives that the individual, to a large extent, finds himself in by appropriating in his own way. And I think that's part of the key here. Jung was very conservative. He didn't say go off and just generate any wacky symbol system. He was very interested. He was very interested in reclaiming the Western symbology, the symbols that we had relied on. But he wanted us to define them, to appropriate them, and each person in schooling in his or her own way.
Yes.
So that one answer to your question, I think, Ryan, is that you're dealing with the images that you produce in dreams and guided imagery and fantasy and that kind of thing. Also imagery that just occurs to you when you're writing. But a lot of that imagery is necessarily rooted in a collective experience.
Mm.
The great thing is how you individuate, which means how you move into conversation with that and become your particular unique Ryan Holzapfel, but not eccentrically in the sense of completely disconnected from any communal experience or narrative that brings us all together. But on the other hand, not in such a way that you become either, as in our current political discourse, either a droid of the right or a droid of the left.
Right.
You either become, a politically correct person for whom the misuse of a pronoun is cause for excoriating the misuser from here to Timbuktu. How could you have misused that pronoun in such a way? It shows what a hegemonic, patriarchal, sexist oppressor you are. Good Lord, where is the room for individuality in that? Or on the other hand, making America great again overlooks a lot of what we know to be, as individuals, to be not so cheery and rosy.
Right.
So in any
Yes.
not a good example. My point is the individual must remain intact, but in conversation with the collective unconscious and archetypal imagery and dynamics. Now, what is that?
Yeah,
And
what is that?
What is that? Well,
Because
my favorite, I think my single favorite quote from Jung, and it's an exact quote, and I think it's from the Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. And I think it's on, I do the page numbers, I think it's on page 68. Is Jung saying, for the collective unconscious is not this thing or that. It is the unknown as it immediately affects us. Again, what is the collective unconscious? The answer, for the collective unconscious is not this thing or that. It is the unknown as it immediately affects us. The unknown as it immediately affects us is a pretty good working definition of God.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
What is the collective unconscious? What is an archetype? Jung at the end of his career, and I can't find this quote, Jung at the end of his career had, and I sense we're going way over.
Yeah, we'll close here in just a minute.
Okay, if I can find it. Well, he said near the end of his career, I think it's in civil, hell's bells. I had it and then I lost it. He said, people have asked me what an archetype is. He said, just this one time, I'm going to allow myself to be poetic. And I'm going to tell you what I really think an archetype is. I'm at the end of my life and here's what it is. He said, an archetype is what God has placed without man's help in the mind of man, the human being, as the place where the individual and God can interact.
Yeah, beautiful.
And he said, it's not something for psychologists or theologians to argue about until they turn blue and drop dead, not having proven anything. An archetype in the collective conscious is just where you, Ryan, finally come into contact with that which abides eternally, that eternal now. And it will produce imagery in you that is symbolic and that is deeply and uniquely individual, some that is historical, some that is encoded in a religious tradition. And all your subpersonalities are working on bringing those things together so that you may move forward in life in hope and in service to others.
Beautiful. I love that. I know that I'm committing a profound Jungian sin.
Please do. I love those.
But I don't know if I believe in the collective unconscious as it's traditionally defined. I do believe in the deeply historical and just absolutely magnificent matrix of connections that all human beings somehow tap into. Yeah. But the node in the network that is the phylogenetic history of the species is so uniquely differentiated from birth that I cannot find myself to be able to agree with the idea that at the core of my complex, for example, is something universal. Because what I fundamentally believe is that it's something emergent. It's emerging from this historical precedent, and it's now never been seen before, and might
Right.
never be seen again. And so if I have a proclivity for aggression, anger, alcoholism, whatever it might be, compassion, creativity, high intelligence, it's not that those things haven't existed, but they don't exist in everybody, and they don't exist in everybody in the same way.
That's
And
right.
the way I interact with the environment, even if it's the exact same environment, is going to be totally different from the person next to me. And that's been proven. So
That's
that's
right.
where I stand right now. Although I also want
I
to
like
say
it.
I respect and see the beauty in the traditional Jungian view and the contemporary Jungian view. And I might be a thorn in people's side as I continue to make very, maybe perhaps even insulting statements to depth psychology or Jungian theory, where people
I
might say,
love it.
are you even a Jungian? How can you say that? Well, maybe I'm not a Jungian. And Jung himself even said, thank God I'm Jung and not a
I'm not a
Jungian.
union.
Because then he can at least change his mind. And maybe I'm not a Jungian in that sense.
Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. I am all for that. I think that is absolutely fantastic, Ryan. I love the way you're going with that. You know, there is a section, if I may, and I'll conclude
Please.
with this. Not the most popular way to end something these days, but a section from one of Paul's epistles where he says it's in Ephesians. He says, you are God's workmanship. That's a mistranslation. The original translation reads, you are God's poema. You are God's poem. It got translated by the good Protestant King James translators as workmanship.
Right.
In fact, every individual is a poetic expression of God. We've been talking about poetry. You are a symbol of the divine. And as a symbol, you are absolutely unique the way every individual is, and every poem is. And you are intuitive and multifaceted and complex and shifting from moment to moment, and not to be subsumed under any web of categories, no matter how powerful. The categories exist to serve you, not you them.
Mm-hmm.
And Jungian psychology is a powerful way of processing a lot that happens in this life of spiritual import more richly than other psychologies do, but ultimately it's not worth a heap of straw. So St. Thomas Aquinas said that about the entire Summa Theologica upon
Beautiful.
his death. It's not worth a bale of straw. Neither is Jungian psychology. What matters is your experience as you move forward as an evolving being in an eternal context. What serves you in that way is true education. And that's always my point as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mays, and
Thank you,
I'm honored
Ryan.
to learn from
I'm
someone as
honored to be
brilliant as
with you.
yourself, and also
Oh,
would
oh,
just add that while there might be areas of Jungian theory that I disagree with, what a brilliant and impactful man in my life that I can read his work
oh, he's
and learn. I
amazing.
mean, I've learned so much from Jung. So my qualms are just in certain areas, and overall just massively supportive of what he's done and what you're doing. And that's a great thing that I'm learning as I get more and more into my graduate studies is having a different opinion does not have to be an emotional experience. And I think when I first was in your introduction class, I didn't understand that yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think I got activated by the idea that I had to fight for the right to think.
Well, you're not
And
entirely wrong, though. But yeah,
right. And I think what that led to is an emotional reaction that felt upsetting because I have something to say. Look, there's this perspective over here, and I don't feel like that's being honored. And now I feel like I'm maturing into the ability to have a calm, reasonable discussion such as this that's based on mutual respect and good faith. And not that it wasn't based on good faith before, but because of the current environment culturally in the school, I think I felt defensive, and I think now I'm learning how to be more tactful. And so that might have been the best development for me academically over the last year and a half since I took your
That's
class.
wonderful, Ryan. That's wonderful, Ryan. Well, you weren't entirely wrong coming out with Duke's Up, because
Right.
the kinds of things you had to say, many of them were not politically correct, and they were countercultural. They were terribly courageous, and I agreed with about 90% of what you said.
Right. Right.
So it's not as if you were wrong,
Yeah.
but also to realize that we are in a discursive process, and so to try to we would do well in culture today generally to turn down the emotions a bit and to try to just take the other person's perspective more objectively in this way. So
Yeah.
good on you, Ryan. And I think the Sorting Myself Out series, we see you doing that. It's a great series. I've been on it twice now, and I'm really touched and honored that you've asked me, although I approached you about this second time. And so thank you very much, Ryan. You
Yeah.
do great work. And I love you, Ryan.
You as well. Love you too.
You're a wonderful, wonderful young scholar. You bring so much to all of this, and the program is great. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be on with
Yeah,
you.
you can come on anytime, just anytime you want, and I'll reach out to you as well. All right.
Okay, we'll be in touch tomorrow then.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I'm kidding. We'll be in touch about that
Whenever
soon.
you want,
Okay.
it's fine.
Okay, Ryan, you're a good man.
All right.
Appreciate it.
See ya.